Let's talk about Java scope inside methods, inside blocks, and understand what is the scope of the code in Java. Hello everyone, this is Ali Reza. Welcome to the Mentor Code Lab. We had a theory video about the scope of code. You can go back and watch it. But here we want to take a look at the concept in practice inside Java. In Java, variables and different parameters that you define inside a piece of code is related to the region they are defined in. And outside of this region, they are not accessible. This is called scope. I had put some code here. If I run it, right now we have an error. Let's walk through it and understand it. First, we are calling a method. Now, this method has an integer called c defined inside the method. This is the scope of the method. Basically, whatever happening between these two curly braces for the method is called the scope of the method. Now here, we are defining a variable inside the scope of this method. Outside of the scope of this method, the variable is not known. And if you look, it says cannot resolve symbol C. It doesn't understand what is C. I don't know because you defined it inside the scope of this method. And this is another method with its own scope and it doesn't understand this C here. However, if I move this from here and move it into the class, don't worry if you don't understand what is the class and I call it static. Now you see that the error is gone because I moved the variable outside of the scope of these two methods in the scope of class. It belongs to the parent. Every child should know about this because its scope is one above themselves. Okay? Now let's take a look at the scope inside a single method here. After this piece of code, we start a scope here with curly braces. Remember, we are defining x inside the scope. Okay? So outside of this scope, if I use x here, it doesn't understand x. You may say, hey, this is not for loop, this is not if loop. We just used an arbitrary curly braces. Yes, but in Java, these curly braces have a very special meaning. They are defining a block of code. So inside the block, if you define a variable inside the scope of the block, outside of the scope of this block, the variable is not known. Of course, before defining it, for sure, we don't know what is the variable here because we didn't define it yet. However, after the definition, because it's inside the scope of the block, outside of the scope, the variable is not known. In C#, these curly braces that is not related to if, for, while, or stuff like that is meaningless. Basically, in C#, you can just use them as decorations to indent to your code and make your code much more readable. But in Java, they have a very dedicated meaning. They are defining a block of code. So if I close this block of code, if you don't see x outside of this block of code, somewhere above or somewhere below, before this line, if I just cut it, you don't see x anywhere. This x is in the scope of this block. And outside of this block, it's not understandable. If we want to make blocks just for more readability, we have another way in IntelliJ IDEA. We will talk about them later, but they are regions. If we want to summarize this short video, we have the scope of a class, we have the scope of a method, we have the scope of a block. Anything inside the scope can see each other, especially when you define them before using them. Outside of the scope of anything, the definitions that happened inside the scope is not reachable. So if I define something as the scope of class, everything inside the class can see this. Okay, so everything after the definition can see the C here. But if I go outside of the main class, because it's a private thing, we won't see that C variable there. If I define something here, and I don't know, number, because I did define this number inside the scope of this method, outside of the scope of method, it's not being seen because I defined x inside the scope of a block. Outside of the block, it's not being seen. Keep in mind, anything that happens inside for loops is the scope of the for loop. Anything that happens inside the scope of if is inside the scope of if. Anything that happens inside the else is inside the scope of else. Anything that happens inside the scope of else if, again, belongs to this scope. Anything that happens inside while is the scope of this while. And anything outside of these scopes can't use the definitions that happen inside the scope. This is a very critical piece of information that you should keep in mind because I had seen some people scratching their head, hey, I did define something here. Why can't I see it outside? Because this is the scope of while. When the while is finished, we have something called garbage collector. The garbage collector says that, hey, now this definition is garbage. So it will put it inside trash can and it will be deleted from memory. When the while loop is finished, outside of the while, nothing is inside the memory to be used after the execution because garbage collector collected them and deleted them from memory, freeing up the memory. And that is why the scopes are important. And if you don't pay attention to these scopes, sometimes you get an issue called memory leakage. If you like these videos, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on that bell so that when I publish a new video, you will get informed. Have fun, everyone. Bye.